and we're working on it, right?
Click the slide.
Okay.
No, I can complain if they don't see me.
Yeah, it's probably just as well.
Really, Tony.
Just as well.
So, these guys can see us, but the public can't see us, or anybody that's requested the Zoom link.
Correct. If the
Okay.
public is watching the live stream,
Yeah.
The public can see us, yeah.
The public can.
People
But
on
not
Zoom.
on-
Appreciate it, yeah.
Yeah, the people on Zoom.
Okay,
can see
got
us,
it.
But the TV people can't. I know that because I was checking on the feed.
Okay, so let's get started. Good morning and welcome. I know you all volunteered to be here this morning, but I do appreciate you coming out in the weather and spending time with us this morning. I just want to make a couple opening remarks, and then I'll turn it over to city manager and staff. Today's meeting, I want to be able to make sure that we're doing everything we can to inform the public of our process and how we're going through these deliberations. So I'm glad that the streaming is working right now. There's a lot of discussion and I think some confusion in the community about what the ARPA funds are, how projects qualify for the ARPA funds. And I don't want to in any way mislead the public or give some false expectations. So I think a step-by-step approach is important for us to go on this route. And today's meeting will likely not get into discussions about specific projects or requests. I would like it to focus on our process, on information, and keeping us ready to be prepared even more so at our next meeting to discuss those kinds of requests that have come to us. So that is my effort. I encourage the body to, during the presentations, ask as many questions as necessary that they feel that will help clarify what's being presented. I do ask that we still observe the rules of recognizing the chair before we speak so that we don't talk over each other and we can keep this meeting moving in an organized way. So I, again, thank staff for being here. And before we get started, I'll turn it over to City Manager Bill Cochran.
Mayor, Council, thank you. As a reminder, this ARPA meeting is a governed body meeting and not per se a staff meeting. Our job here is to provide you with information so you guys can make decisions and set expectations. With that being said, there has been some new information put out as to what ARPA can be spent on in that process. And so with that, Amanda, our city attorney, has put together information for you. And at this point, I'll turn it over to her to give you those updates.
Okay, thank you. I think Liz is starting to share the PowerPoint. So the city manager asked me to give you just a brief update about what the law says that ARPA funds can be used for. If you recall, back in May, Treasury had published its interim rule regarding what uses could be used for. They received input over the following 7 months of people that loved what they did, people that hated what they did, and the final rule came out this month. So we've spent the last week or so studying the 300-page final rule to make sure that we have an in-depth understanding for you on what you can actually spend this money from. As of now, you can follow either rule. You can follow the interim rule or the final rule. Final rule has a lot more flexibility, so I'd recommend we just go ahead and act like it's already in effect, even though it doesn't take effect until April. So there are key changes to each of the four major uses for ARPA. The four major ways that a local government can use the money is to replace lost sector revenue for public health and economic impact expenses, including capital expenditures now. You can use it for premium pay for eligible workers, and then you can use it for eligible water, sewer, and broadband and infrastructure costs. The first major change that I want to draw your attention to is the changes in how you can use it for replacing lost revenue. Originally, they had a calculation that we could determine what our lost revenue was compared to a presumed growth that they presumed everyone across the country would have. That rule is still in effect, although they've changed the percentages a little. They also added a separate rule that would allow you to use a standard deduction. So think about it on your taxes. You can either take the standard or you can itemize it based off which one makes the most sense for you. The standard is $10 million. So our finance director, Steve, ran the calculations, which are in here if you want to see the work or the public wants to see the work on how we came up to what the city of Topeka's presumed lost revenue would be. But the bottom line number is if you look at our presumed revenue compared to the counterfactual belief of what the government thinks we would have grown at, the city could designate up to $55 million as lost revenue. We only received $47 million or so, so that basically means if you wanted to, through 2023, you could designate all of this as presumed lost revenue. That opens it up, and basically once it's presumed lost revenue, you can use it for any kind of government service. We still have to show that it was spent on government services before the deadline, but at that point, the rest of the rules would not really make much of a difference because as long as it's government services, it could be used. If you don't want to do that, there's other rules on what you can use for various things. So these money can be used to support public health and economic responses. The Treasury Department has enumerated several things specifically that if you use it for these types of things, it's automatically covered. These include things like vaccination programs, such as the city's incentive to get employees vaccinated. That's a program that's specifically allowed for reimbursement. Communication efforts when it comes to pandemic-related communication, paid family and medical leave for employees for COVID purposes, support for prevention and mitigation strategies. There's lots of behavioral health uses for mental health because the Treasury Department has determined that 2 years of social isolation has had numerous mental health effects, so there's mental health programs. The money can be used to respond to violence and gun issues in your community because Treasury has found that there's been a proliferation of violent crime over the last 2 years across the entire nation. It can be used for utility assistance. It can be used to help citizens pay delinquent property taxes. It can be used for job training, child care programs in specific instances where they're licensed child care facilities. You can support long-term housing. You can remediate lead. The theory behind that is that people have spent more time in their houses, so that has higher exposure to lead. You can invest in neighborhoods that have been disproportionately impacted. You can spend that on parks and green spaces, recreational facilities, sidewalk repair, and these are neighborhoods that are generally in qualified census tracts. You can even use it to remove vacant and abandoned properties in qualified census tracts. These are residential and commercial buildings, so if you have demolition costs related to a particular building that is in one of these areas, it can be used for that. Small business assistance. The final rule does go through quite a bit about how you do have to show that the small business was actually affected and that what you are doing is reasonably proportional to the risk. Same with nonprofits. So the guidelines are just a little bit more specific about being able to show that the harm has been related to the pandemic. Assistance to designated industries such as travel, tourism, hospitality are specifically allowed expenses. If one of the industries that has been affected by the pandemic is outside of that, you have to show that they had at least 8% unemployment loss or an employment loss due to pre-pandemic levels. So you can designate other industries as being affected besides travel, tourism, and hospitality, but there's certain rules that we have to use to show it. You can use the money to bolster and restore public sector capacity. So it could be used for payroll expenses to bring employees back on that were laid off during the pandemic of the city government. It can also be used for worker retentions. The Treasury Department recognizes that right now it is very hard to retain employees across every industry, so perhaps that's a use that the local government might need. The money can support the city's technology infrastructure, and that is under the concept that if citizens can access their government easier, it's easier to respond to things like pandemics and economic harms. So any kind of IT system and delivery system, this money could be used for. And then any kind of other capital expenditure that responds to the public health and negative economic impacts. The third category is premium pay for eligible workers performing essential work. This would be things like the premium COVID incentive that was given to fire and police departments. This money can pay for that incentive. It can also provide premium pay to other local government workers that were not teleworking and had regular interactions with the public or their coworkers in order to perform their work. If you had a city department that was completely teleworking during the pandemic, they would not be eligible. But if other city workers had to be in places around the public and they had to do that to continue to keep government functioning, you can use premium pay for that. And then finally, you can use it to invest in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. The final rule opened up this category quite a bit. So any eligible project under the EPA Clean Water State Revolving Fund, any project that's eligible under the EPA Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, additionally, anything that's stormwater infrastructure, residential wells, lead remediation, rehabilitation of dams and reservoirs, all of those are eligible projects. In addition, if you have an infrastructure project that deals with water, sewer, and broadband, and you can show it's necessary meeting this test, that also qualifies. So basically, if you can show that there's an identifiable need in order to maintain a minimum level of service, and that there's a cost-effective way to do this, then you can use that for an investment in infrastructure under ARPA rules. Just to clarify, there's a couple things that these funds cannot be used for. You can't use it for extraordinary contributions to a pension fund. I don't think we have that problem in Kansas because our city fund is fully funded, but other states that do not have fully funded pensions have looked at this. You can't use it for debt service or replenishments of rainy day funds. You can't use it because you were sued and were trying to pay off a big judgment. But other than that, you can pretty much use it for any government service once you've designated it for lost revenue. Finally, some administrative details. These funds must be used for costs incurred after March 3rd, 2021. The rationale behind that is that we had the first version of CARES money for expenses before that, so these are supposed to be expenses after that. The costs must be obligated by December 31st, 2024, and the funds must actually be expended by December 31st, 2026. Funds designated as revenue loss can be used to meet non-federal cost share requirements or matching requirements of other federal programs. Any funds used in violation of the rules are subject to recoupment, so the federal government can come after us for making sure that we use these correctly. And then finally, the city has various reporting requirements that finance will be working on to make sure that we meet all of our reporting requirements and we show that we've used the money appropriately so that we don't have to worry about it. And that is your brief legal summary about ARPA.
Okay, before we move on, I'll go around the room and for governing body members on the screen, do you have any questions or further detail you'd like to ask at this point? Councilman Emerson.
Thank you, Mayor. Ms. Stanley, thank you for your presentation, and this is really helpful to me. I did have a question, though. So it looks like there's two pathways here we can go down. One is considered all lost revenue, and under that, it can be used for
Any governmental service.
Okay. And then the other is kind of enumerated, the different uses.
Correct.
Is there an advantage of going the second route? Because it seems like the second route is much more cumbersome and maybe has more reporting requirements.
The second route would have a lot more reporting requirements. The first route would be the easiest reporting requirement.
Okay, are there things you can do under the second one that you couldn't do under the first one?
No.
Okay.
The second route is, the first one is anything governmental services. So anything you do as a city would qualify as governmental services. The second route is these are specific reasons. So let's say, our number is 55 million of lost revenue, but the state's not going to have a lost revenue that equals the amount they got. So they're going to have to go down the second route. So there's going to be specific guidelines that they'll have to follow. Does that make sense?
It does. So that I'm not misunderstanding you here, we can spend the money under pathway one, saying it's all just lost revenue, with far fewer reporting requirements.
Correct.
We can spend the money for all the same things that are enumerated in option 2?
Correct. Because all of those are governmental services.
Okay. So in our case, why would we even consider going down the route that the only thing it adds is more complications, right?
I think that's a policy decision for all of you. Some local governments would want to go down Route 2 just to show the public, we're using this specifically for those reasons.
Okay.
We're not using it as revenue necessarily, but ultimately it's just a policy choice if you want to go down option 1 or option 2.
And
Yes, please.
and I guess then a follow-up would be how certain we are we on that $55 million amount? Because being able to use all of it under option 1 means that's a bulletproof number, then the 55 million, or how bulletproof
I'll turn
is
that
it?
over to Steve, who did all those calculations.
Great.
We're pretty certain that it's solid.
Okay.
It assumes a 5.2% year-over-year growth factor. Topeka hasn't seen 5.2% for quite some time. And so based on that, unless, the economy just absolutely goes boom, we're pretty solid on that.
So that 5.2 is just kind of a safe harbor. We can use that as what it should have been.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilwoman Hiller and then Councilwoman Valdivia Alcala.
Thank you. This is clarification only. We came into, a couple of weeks ago with the detailed requirements from the past. And we now have this new rule that's going to go into effect in April. I would have called the old one option 1 and the new one option 2. So I'm trying to make sure you're saying that the new one that's coming in is option 1, the one that's a wide open pot, and that the old one is option 2, the one that identifies, if you will.
Yes, okay, so the first rule was the interim rule. This is the final rule.
Okay.
So it's the final. It's getting published. Under the final rule, they made it broader than the interim rule in response to comments from the public. So yes, I think.
Okay. So going with the one that's kind of unlimited, if you will, government use, has more reporting requirements, is what you're calling option 1, but it has more strings attached to it on the reporting end. The option 2, the old one, if we were comfortable within those, that one's an easier process for reporting?
I think we're talking about 4 different things instead of 2 is the problem.
Okay.
So the first interim rule didn't allow us to recoup everything as lost revenue. Then we have this final rule, which came up with a new test that says you can do 10 million as lost revenue, or you can do this calculation using 5.2%, which for us equals about 55 million. If you do lost revenue, that is just one way to spend your money out of 4 ways. In our case, that first way could be all of the money. Doesn't mean you have to use it. It's still just one way that you can designate this money. So if you chose to designate it all as lost revenue, you're just using all your money in that first category rather than the other 3 categories that are optional uses. Does that clarify it?
For me, I don't really care how we got there. It's just what options do we have on the table and which bucket choice is better for us to go in.
Correct. There's 4 buckets that you can use your money for. Lost revenue, or the other 3 buckets, premium pay, negative economic impact, that I went through. So it's just, do you want to put all your money in bucket 1, or do you want to spread it out through bucket 1 through 4?
And the bucket 1, the lost revenue, basically allows you to spend it however you want to spend it, all of it.
Yes, you can spend it in the other 3 buckets, sorry.
Yeah.
So it's the same. I'm just trying to figure out whether we need to
I just did that this week.
be following that further.
Councilwoman Valdivia Alcala.
Okay, small mind, small question. 55, so if we do that one bucket where it's lost revenue for the city, that all goes into whatever big city fund Would that be a separate fund? Would that go general fund? Would that go?
We have separated our funds, so it is separate. So it's not mixed in with our general fund for tracking purposes.
So it'd be a city ARPA fund?
Yes, ma'am.
And that would just mean the whole amount would go in there, and then the city could still take requests on however, from entities to determine how the money is to be spent.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, got it.
Councilwoman Hiller, did you have follow-up?
And it's still just the 47 million, though. The number is the same
Yes.
that we have available. Okay. Just- Thank you. Thank you.
Further questions before we move on? Okay, Councilman Lesser.
Yeah, I don't have a question, kind of a statement though, just I think to not only for us, I mean, most of us I think understand this, but for the public as well. And I know we're not talking at this point in individual allocations of where we're going to do, but I think it is a good point to, from overall with this process, understand that this is one-time money as we move forward, versus the fact that it's reoccurring, meaning as we decide where we're going to, which fund, which projects that we're going to do, it's a one-time distribution that we have to be careful. And I want the public to understand that if there's someone, when we get to the next phase and I also say this to save some work coming to us and saying, hey, we want this money to go start this program. That program, the money would be there possibly to start it, but it's not going to be there to continually fund it. We would have to find other funding for that. So I think it's important that we explain what the ground rules are and the effects of one-time money versus recurring money. That's all.
Thank you, Councilman. That's important to note, and I think the governing body understands that, but I think it's important to bring out for the public so they understand that we're not, at least initially, looking at anything to start creating new positions that would require funding after those ARPA funds are expended. So I appreciate you bringing that out. Further questions or comments? Okay, city manager is the next one up, Steve. Mr. Wade, you have a presentation or you have some information you want to share with us as well?
We have prepared, and the Infrastructure Committee has seen this, the Finance and Policy Committee has seen this back in November. We have prepared, if, City Manager, if this is what you're talking about, a financial estimate moving forward over the next 5 years. And basically what we did was we took a look at our payroll estimated increases due to contractual obligations. We also took a look at expected increases in non-payroll, and looking forward, tried to estimate out then what we could theoretically afford. We also took a look at our debt service fund, which is probably most applicable for this conversation. And in doing so, took a look at what our borrowing amounts were for both GEO and utilities. What that allowed us to do, if you'll slip to the next slide right there, our projections allow for CIP money, for capital expense money, to be about $9 million a year, which is what you've been averaging. $27 million over 3 years is the policy requested by the governing body. We can afford to continue to do that. If the ARPA money was used for infrastructure expenses, you have the ability then to pay down some of that debt. If you roll to a couple of slides farther along, and a couple more. Oh, here it is. So the slide that's in front of you at the moment is for utility bonds. What we're looking at is total debt service has been increasing over the last several years. We looked at scenarios to see, is there a way to where our total bonded amount, our debt amount could start dropping? And to get to that point, our estimates suggested that without utility rate increases, additional utility rate increases, we could only spend $17 million a year on utility bonds. The advantage to ARPA is that allows you to expend beyond the $17 million and still control your debt levels so that they're not increasing. If you do not use ARPA for infrastructure, what that does is it hampers your ability to continue water line replacement and other options that the utilities department has recommended to the city manager. Some of those who I believe you've seen in your packets.
Any questions right at this point?
To your left.
Councilwoman Valdivia Alcala.
Thank you. Well, so we're talking about ARPA money, but, and it sounds like there's, some, I don't know, move to perhaps suggest to help put some of that in the utilities bucket, right? Just saying that that's an option.
Yes, ma'am.
And paying that with ARPA cash rather than, because we'll only have 17 million that we can do a year. And so we can up some of that if we use some of the ARPA funds, right?
That's correct.
Are we not going to be getting some additional infrastructure money from that trillion or whatever that is coming down the pike?
We don't know the answer to that. The Kansas Department of Commerce and the SPARK Committee will control a lot of that. We believe, and those advisories have not totally come down yet, but we believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Amanda, but those will be competitively bid. And so if we have a project that we will have to go to the state and basically apply to receive funding on it, one of the things that I heard in a briefing from the Department of Commerce is that would likely, they would favor water line replacement, lead line replacement, et cetera. But we just don't know enough on that yet to know what we might or might not get.
Is there more that's going to be coming out by the end of this legislative session?
They're working on it, but the thing with the infrastructure dollars, those went directly to the state. They're
Right.
not,
Got it.
and so we don't control. But yes, they are making some determination by mid-February as to how some of those dollars are going to be allocated and spent. But as Steve said, the rest of those dollars are going to be competitive bid dollars. So we'll be applying for those just like Kansas City, Wichita, and other metropolitan areas. So there's no guarantee. Is there the possibility we're going to get some? Yes. But there's no guarantee as to what those dollars look like and how much they are.
But we know that we'll be able to competitively bid. That we do know for sure. And it's just going to be if we get them or not. But there is money possibility there as well. That's all I'm trying to discern.
That's my understanding.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, Councilwoman Nager.
Yes, thank you. So with talking about the infrastructure bill and the ARPA funds, are there specific projects that we can go ahead and have freedom to fund with ARPA funds so we could have a little bit more leeway as opposed to the infrastructure bill, or vice versa? Are there, and I mean to ask this to see how we can maximize the use of these funds to make sure that we're keeping utility rates the most consistent that we can for citizens, and that we're getting the biggest bang for our buck.
Yes, we can identify projects that qualify under the rules and go ahead and move forward with those projects with the current dollars we have.
Okay. When would we know a little bit? Would we kind of just follow the bid process that we would set up for any third-party applications to come to us? Would we kind of bid our own projects that same way as far as talking about infrastructure, specifically with water lines?
Well, it'd be like the lead pipe removal. That would be a process that we would bid out for a contractor to replace those.
Okay.
But the difference is we have those dollars in hand, so it's not like we have to wait to bond it and all that other stuff before we do a lot of the processes. We have the dollars on hand, so we go ahead and do those in a quicker fashion.
Okay. Well, yeah, my recommendation would be just continuing to look into all of this to maximize how much we can really get done with this money, especially if we're looking at, I know in District 6, I drive past, since this last winter storm, there's just holes everywhere where they've been working and working and working. My neighbor's yard has been torn up for the second time in a new spot, in the last time for 2 years. So I'm really excited to see that the existing infrastructure also get improved. Also, I know that there's areas in East Topeka and North Topeka that need that initial infrastructure with gutters and sewers and all of that. So I don't know if there's any flexibility with that as well to make sure that we can get that initial infrastructure in for those areas that have desperately needed it for decades. Thank you.
Mr. Wade, did you comment?
If we can go back to the PowerPoint, I want to show one particular number that maybe will help this body. So on this particular slide, and I realize it's hard to see from where you're at, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah.
But short version is, if we look at what the amount of money that we're going to have to bond this year in 2022 for utilities specific, we're expecting about $63 million this year, and an additional 35 next year of bonded money for utilities projects that this body has already approved. Now, that could end up changing between 22, 23, 24, but in essence, you've got about $100 billion that you've got to bond based on previously approved projects. And so the ARPA money, anything that you use towards infrastructure is money reduced that you'll have to bond, if that makes sense.
Councilman Emerson.
Thank you, Mayor. So, Mr. Wade, I know I got the financial dream team here behind me, which I think helped you produce some of these. My question is, we've heard just in the last week the Federal Reserve now saying we're going to do 4 rate increases next year. Do these, and you wouldn't have known that at the time you produced this a couple months ago, how might that affect future interest rates if they raise 0.25% each? I mean, I guess a 1% cumulative over next year?
I would say that we were optimistic when we prepared this, and that the rates now may be a little higher than what we expected, which makes your cost of borrowing higher.
Okay, thank you. Is this something you could redo with a, I guess now we know they're talking about 4 rate increases, which it seems like they always do at least 1/4 point, if not 1/2 point.
Yeah, the way the project was built by Adam and Josh, we can plug in any numbers you want.
That would be great if you
very
could
quickly.
provide that, please.
Right.
Thank you.
So what you just said, not knowing a lot about finances, is this taking into account what we might be looking at as well with the increase of inflation every year, or is that kind of what you're?
Two different things. The cost of inflation that we used on our calculations were 3%, and we're already seeing that currently. And so if inflation continues to grow, then the expenses would go higher. The rate increases would either have to go up on utilities or the borrowing go down to continue to pay our bills. What Councilman Emerson is specifically talking about is the cost of borrowing. So the loans that we're going to take out are going to continue to get more expensive if the rates keep going up.
So as we look at spending this money over, so many years, or maybe it's all going to go in one place, I mean, is it feasible to do projections like what, he said and what we're looking at in the rate of inflation? Because doesn't that ultimately impact all of this a lot, or maybe not so much? Or
all the estimates are best guesses, in all honesty. And so it's just a matter of how optimistic or pessimistic you want to be moving forward.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks.
Councilman Doler?
Thank you, Mayor. Before we get too much further into these fantastic spreadsheets, I know it's almost 10 o'clock on Saturday. I'd love nothing more than to do that. But just playing a little bit on Councilman Lesser's comments, I wonder if it might be good for us to set some initial parameters for discussion. We've already talked a little bit about this, and a couple of things that come to my mind that have really already been said is, can this body agree that a major goal is debt reduction through, obviously we can't pay down debt. I think that was one of the prohibited actions, but we can pay cash for projects as opposed to bonding. So, and we've already talked a little bit about that. Another one that comes to mind that I think we've talked a little bit about in past council meetings is for whatever the portion of money that goes outside of the city for nonprofits or whatever, that we set up some sort of application program that tracks specific outcomes. However we do that, we've got experience of that already, and feels like we certainly need to continue to follow that procedure as opposed to line item expenditures. I would also, a couple of other things that come to my mind. One is, and I think Councilman Lesser alluded to that, I don't feel like we should fund any program that creates new FTEs for the city, that we have to continue to fund once these dollars are expended. And I'd also like to, and maybe this isn't a prohibition, but certainly be cognizant of programs that are being funded by ARPA. ARPA's a huge bill, $1.9 trillion. What we're talking about is $350 million that went to cities and counties and states. There's a lot of other programs out there. You can look them up. Housing programs, child care programs, all kinds of things. I would hope that we take a look at all of those as we look at expenditures of these funds and make sure we're just not doubling up. If there's opportunities for folks that need those funds to get them from some other portion of ARPA, great. If not, then yeah, they should be eligible for whatever we get to. So just to recap, I think it's debt reduction, it's application programs and tracking for non-city expenditures. Those are kind of the two big ones on my mind. Hopefully we're not funding any future positions, and also look at other things. So that's my comments. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, sir. Councilman Duncan?
So I will first echo that and then add to what
Councilman Dobler said. I think we actually, at the end of the day, have two conversations we have to have, and I think they're both the same and different. I think at some point we need to determine what we want what we'll call the community funds to look like. I mean, pick a dollar amount and say this is whether it's 3 million, 5 million, 10, I don't know what that, or we can have, and make that determination so that then we can have two conversations, because I think then we know this is the pot of money on the city side, and let's talk about what we want those parameters to be. And then here's the pot of money we've established for the community, and what do we want those parameters to be? Because I think if we don't do that, we cross-talk a little bit some of these monies, and because while I think they should be similar parameters, I'm going to say here in a second, I think they could obviously very much be slightly different. And I think until we make that distinction, I think also knowing those amounts helps whatever process we pick. It lets staff know, okay, we've told you have $40 million or $38 million to come back with recommendations or conversations, and we know that whoever we task with looking at those community dollars, this is what your pot is. They always tell you when you come into money or inherit money, the first two things you should deal with are debt and your home, right? It's your biggest expense. It's there forever. It's where you live, and obviously debt allows you to have money moving forward. I've gone back and forth on these ARPA funds a lot since they were announced, and I think I've come down to that's exactly what we need, the prism we need to look at it on the city side, is putting those funds into those areas, capital improvements and infrastructure, which obviously lead to that debt reduction since we can't directly pay it. And so I very much support us looking at it on the city side. Truthfully, I support that same position to some degree on the community fund side, because the same concerns that we've all expressed and the Councilman Lesser expressed here today are, there are so many good programs out there. Of course there are. But the problem is we fund them today, and then in 3 years, those groups are back here asking us to continue to support those programs, and I'm concerned that that's not possible. That doesn't mean that there's a lot of groups out there who don't need help in other ways, whether their building needs a new kitchen to continue their mission, or that new roof they've been trying to raise money for, whatever that falls into, capital improvements and infrastructure projects for their community, their area, their specific organization. So we can have that discussion further, but I sort of also look at it like that, and I think there's still a lot of good that can be done that way. But at its core, I do think we at some point need to have that conversation about what dollars look for each pile, and then how we want each of those conversations to go to keep us down that path. So thank you, Mayor.
It's bucket, by the way.
Bucket, I know, bucket. We got our buckets. I'm going to bring some to the council meeting, visuals to keep us.
Councilwoman Valdivia Acala.
Thank you, Mayor. Okay, so just to clarify, to make sure I understand what everybody said, we need to get our process down. Debt reduction is what we hope all of us as a council are committed to at some level. It may not be all the same dollar amount, but debt reduction, number one. The other part with infrastructure, I also agree with. I mean, I'm thinking about I'm thinking more neighborhood infrastructure, things of that nature. So I don't know if when you guys say infrastructure, if you mean that within neighborhoods, if you mean that with human infrastructure, or clarify that?
Councilman Dobler.
Yeah, good question. I think, we've kind of mixed the conversation here a little bit, but neighborhood infrastructure is things we typically either cash fund or fund through GO bonds, I believe. Is that correct? Neighborhood projects certainly would qualify. You can say debt reduction, but really there's two different buckets of debt in the city, and that's GO bonding, which we pay for through property tax, and utility bonding, which is, and we're going to be faced at some point with, do we have to raise the mill levy? Do we have to raise the water rates? And can we ameliorate those impacts by using those funds? So I don't know if that helps.
It does. And then what you said about, and I think I agree with you on this, about not using this fund to support any FTEs. Now, would that be just within the city, or would that be any like nonprofit that may come up? Because I don't think it should either. I think if we're looking at community needs, it should be established programs that are just trying to do better and get better, but have the employees, in place. When I think about things like digital equity, I think what can we get out there in the community that can help spread this out, that's not going to need a whole bunch of positions added to it. You know what I'm saying? And so I just wanted clarity. Is that kind of where you were going with that too?
Absolutely. I think it goes back to what Councilman Duncan said. We have to have two different conversations. So direction to city staff on how to spend whatever the pot looks like or bucket. And then whatever committee, whatever we do to distribute those community dollars, I think was your term, and I like that. Yeah, what are the parameters there? It's for capital expenses, it's for one-time cost, and not something that somebody's going to be coming back in 3 years asking for more.
Got it. So how are we going to establish that? How are we going to pick which one is first?
I think that's why I want to make sure we take step-by-steps on this so that we're clear on what we're wanting to do as a body. I think we also have to revisit the priorities of the body. We set those out again, look at those and keep those in consideration when we're deciding what community funds that we're going to support. And also, I like the comments about making sure we don't fund projects that already have other avenues of funding so that we don't double track over that. And for what we have as a resource in funding, we're able to more evenly distribute it and make sure that those who receive those funds clearly understand our intent, that it's not to establish, like you say, new FTEs where in 3 years they'll come back and ask for us to continue that funding, because that's not my understanding of our intent. And I do like the thought and the ideas about how we look at debt reduction through keeping our focus on using cash rather than bonding. I think that will help us. I think we have to look far ahead for those possibilities of raising the mill levy or the utilities. I'm very concerned that we would have to go into that position again, because that's tough. That's something that affects every single person in this community, and I think we have to give them thorough consideration before we decide, okay, you're on your own. Was it Councilman Kell? See your hand, then Councilman Lesser.
One thing that I was participating when I was in the Navy for several years was a budget situation where the different departments came in and presented what they wanted, and we could use this with the community side also and the department heads to come in, present what they're wanting, and then we can look at the long-term effects that it can have, and then also we can go through that application process on the outside and see if the ARPA money can be received from another entity rather than us. And it kind of sets us up with a baseline and educates everyone about where we want the money, and we can ask follow-up questions and things like that, where it kind of almost sets up a very transparent way of where we're going to use the money, and allows everyone to kind of learn as we're going along in this situation.
Thank you. Councilman Lesser?
One thing that I don't want to get lost, that it is obviously one of the major advantages of this program, and I don't want to, it's not the same program, so I don't want to say that the Corps of Engineers or that was back in the 50s, whatever it was, but the same thing comes into play here to a certain extent, that I think we need to, as we look at this, where we do talk about, hey, we don't want to add new FTE jobs here. We don't want to, have recurring expenses that I did talk about. The other thing, though, as we look at that, though, when we do look at infrastructure things such as, streets, curbs in North Topeka, roads, sidewalks, and then we can, I'm just throwing names out here, but then we look at, I can't remember who just brought it up, but a new kitchen. Let's just say LULAC needs a new kitchen that they've been wanting, that we want to do something like that. With fear of using the word trickle down, The reality of that, though, is when we do those programs, we are creating also jobs, though, for the Bettis Asphalts, the Sunflower, the whoever the remodeler is that's doing the Lulac kitchen and those type of things. And the hope then also is they're buying their materials in Topeka and Shawnee County. So we're creating revenue from tax sales, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we need to be cognizant as well as of how we can accomplish some of those things through an emphasis in capital improvements, streets, roads, curbs, roofs, et cetera, et cetera. So while it may not look like, boom, hey, we've created, at the city or with such and such, if we do these programs, then clearly we're creating some of those jobs probably, and then those guys are going out to eat at downtown, they're going and spending their money at XYZ. So, it's if you look at it from the big picture down of where we spend our money, there can be some serious positive repercussions of the way the money's spent. And I think that's what the intent of the program really is. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilwoman Ortiz and then Councilwoman Nager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I don't know if I'd use Bettis. I'd probably use Henderson Construction before I use Bettis. But that's just me. I like how this conversation's going, and because there is so much that needs to be done. I want to talk about infrastructure and tubing, especially in my district and in Christina's district, and some of Antonio's district. We have maybe in District 5 a little bit too, but we don't have curbs and gutters. We have ditches, and they're not maintained. But we still pay the same share of water and sewer. And I've brought this up before. I have a 90-some-year-old lady that has tubing that is rotting out. And I'd like to see us get some type of program in there and some type of schedule that our constituents can get this tubing, just like her. She's on a fixed income and she can't afford it, but she still pays the same as everybody else. I know that there was a lady that came on and she talked about a corner in District 2 where the water is not flowing correctly, and again, there's some proper tubing that needs to go in there. We pay the same, and we need to be, if you have a curb in front of your house, I'll use Tony to pick on, and that curb gets broke, the city comes out, they maintain it, and they pay for it. But ours, I had to replace mine. The city will put it in, but I had to buy the tubing. Tony didn't have to buy the concrete, and I just think it would help in these areas that are being flooded. We need to get some type of maintenance on that. So I'll be pushing for that new tubing, that we get some of that ARPA money for the residents over here. And it will also help the streets. Some of our streets, I've called Neo and Tony to look at a street that constantly continues to flood, to buckle out. Our crews go out several times, and I will continue to do that. But I do like the conversations that we're having in the parameters. I had my hand up several times, but I think Hannah beat me to the punch. Are we going to continue, even though we decide to put money into, let's say we do it like our infrastructure, are we going to continue to look at, Christine had brought up that the state money and when will we know? Will staff continue to monitor that? So if we get back some of that kickback money, so if we get any of that, we can continue to take that money and put it somewhere else. That's one of my questions. And then when Amanda talked about matching money, is that on the city side or will that be on our side that will be matching money? Have we thought about that?
Amanda, would you like to respond?
The matching money is simply one option. So there's federal programs that we have to match X amount with a local share for water projects, for example. We could use ARPA money as our matching share. Generally, federal programs don't let you use federal money to match, but this is an exception.
Okay. Anything further, Councilwoman?
No, I just wanted to know if staff was going to continue to monitor whatever way we go on the infrastructure money. I just don't want to see saying, oh, we're going to go this way, if they will continue to monitor to make sure that we get our fair share of that, if we get any of it.
Okay, thank you.
Will they continue to do?
Councilwoman
So I can
Nager.
use,
Oh, sorry.
so I can use my tubing money.
Councilwoman Nager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Kind of going back to what Lester was talking about, he said, I hesitate to use trickle down. The way that I see it is maximize the benefits and really see that exponential use of the money, making sure that, we put it here in the community and it continues to circulate in our community and grow in our community. He's nodding, so I feel good about how I interpreted that. And to what Sylvia was saying, make sure that as we're prioritizing these projects, people are getting their money's worth for what they're paying into the city. And also, I know that we're looking at this with 12th Street, that we started all the way down with replacing the water main and then building from there to make sure that we're not redoing 12th Street in 2 years because we did one project at the top and didn't do anything at the bottom. So, and especially prioritizing these projects within the city for the infrastructure, making sure that we are building in that same smart way. So we do projects once. And again, we're maximizing that money and spreading it out as much as possible rather than just doing a project saying we did a great job and then coming back and having to use taxpayer money from the community rather than from the federal government. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilman Dobler.
Thank you, Mayor. You know, it occurs to me that as we talk about the buckets here, if we set aside the community bucket and look at the city bucket, we have an opportunity, I think, to have an impact in the parts of our community that were probably hit a lot harder with COVID. And I know the bulk of the funding for utilities or whatever it is, we're going to have to rely on the staff to tell us which projects give us the most return and all those sorts of things. Understand that. I think we can designate a portion of that to, whether it's LMI neighborhoods, whether it's neighborhood projects, Sylvia's projects for replacing piping under entrances. There are so many things out there that we have struggled as a community with over the years, and I've been involved in some of them. Parts of town where we have no sidewalks, no storm sewer, and folks don't have the means to do those things on their own. This seems like it's a great opportunity and would do both things. It would reduce our debt because we'd be spending cash on it, and we'd be having an impact in those parts of town where they've been hit harder, frankly, than other parts of town. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Councilwoman Valdivia-Acala.
I would echo, ditto to what Sylvia said, ditto to what Neil is saying. I think that this is an opportunity for the amount of money that's decided to go into LMI communities to really try to add on the initiatives that are building within the city to go outside to these communities as well as Topeka as a whole to say, hey, we know we need to do some things differently. We're willing to change our culture within the city, and we can help with neighborhoods to change their culture as well. And I think that this is an opportune time to let residents know, especially in LMI districts, that we are serious about this intention. Does that mean that there has to be, an absolutely huge and inordinate percentage out of the whole 47 million to go to that? Of course not. That's what we're here to do, is to have that tension of dialogue to see what goes where and what bucket it goes in. I think of something specifically that is a bone of contention within many LMI communities, and that is if their sidewalks have not been repaired, where it is a quality of life issue where they cannot even walk on their sidewalks. They can't take their elders out for walks on the sidewalks. They can't take, baby strollers out there and walk around. They have to walk on the streets because the sidewalks are in such bad condition. And we also know that that is something that code does not have a tendency to write up a lot, because in these LMI districts, these are folks that often are on fixed incomes when we think about our elders or those on disability, and they cannot afford the 50/50 program. If it was me, I would say get rid of the 50/50 program just completely. But I know that that's not a reality, even though it should be a reality. But at any rate, what I'm thinking is, why can't, as a one-time, because we know this is one-time money, put a chunk of money into that 50/50 program and use that intentionally with diligence, with fairness, and let folks see, we see you, we hear you, and this is what we can do. It's not going to be $5 million over 5 years. It has to be controlled amount because there's so many other things that we need in this city. But it's one way for our LMI folks to know that they are being seen and quality of life issues are being addressed. Thank you, Mayor.
Councilman Callan and Councilwoman Hiller.
One area we also need to look at, I think, is just our city buildings and the health of the buildings. Specifically, I recently toured a couple of the firehouses, and there's leaky roofs, there's mold in the buildings. We need to look at, especially like with the men and women in the fire department, they live in those buildings 48 to 72 hours a week. And we need to look at the health of our city workers as the health of the building. So we need to start also looking what that's going to cost, and to try to get it healthy, especially for like I said, the firefighters who live in that building.
Councilwoman Hiller.
Thank you, Mayor. I think this conversation's going really well in terms of what people are offering and coming back to. I think that Neil laid out those 4 points at first that there seems to be consensus on, and Steve with the projections on what it could do to utility fees or getting more done in neighborhoods, all neighborhoods, for instance, for the infrastructure projects. I came in with a couple of overlay thoughts, I guess, and it seems that we're digging deep enough and starting to talk about some specifics that maybe it's timely for that. The first ties in with, it's a different way to say what Neil did, I think, in terms of, is this a strategic investment? Is it going to be worth more than we're spending on it? Is it going to be here in 10 years? Is it going to make a difference over time? Will it have a lifetime after this money? The kinds of examples we're talking about are good ones along that line. It's just a little different spin on it, that maybe once we get past setting our fundamental criteria, we'll need to be able to kind of rank and rate what we're looking at if we, both on the community side and on the utility side. The other thing is that, and it's come up a little bit, is should the city be paying for this at all, or should ARPA money be paying for it? And that's where our heads may get to a point where they're going to explode. But for instance, for neighborhood projects like Councilwoman Ortiz and Councilwoman Valdivia Alcala have mentioned, we are going into our first year of the DREAMS competitive money for $1.7 million that the different LMI neighborhoods can bid on this year. And that's an opportunity to say we want to start working our way through X neighborhood with tubing or with sidewalks, so that we already have set that up to go. And so maybe we don't need ARPA money for that, but we're still, because we're doing it. Or, we've talked about broadband before. If broadband's coming through the state and we don't need to use our local money for it, and we have a short list anyway, that was our third handout for today of what staff is seeing coming down from other sources to be available. And we talked about that both for community-based projects, if they could get that money through another source, but ourselves as well. So, whether just somebody else altogether should be doing it, not being afraid to look at the county's list, because we are 70% of the county, to see if there's some things we should be going in together on and things like that. So I'm glad that we have a project list as big as we do, and that people are thinking broadly, but the labor then will be to sift that a little bit and make sure the ARPA is the most strategically used we can use it for. So, thank you.
Councilwoman Valdivia Alcala.
Thank you, Mayor. The other thing I wanted to also find out is when you had talked about not wanting to duplicate efforts, and I believe that that's really valid too. So let's use the example of childcare, okay? We know that there are childcare in certain areas. We have childcare deserts in this city, right? We also have lost a number of childcare centers, childcare workers because of COVID, and in many cases, they should be seen as essential workers. But let's say that there was a proposal that was put forward to either offer incentives or more dollars for what many believe are essential workers of childcare workers. It's also greatly, when you talk about economic development, I would imagine as a young family with 1 or 2 or 3 kids, I would want to know that I was moving into a city that had quality, good, accessible, not driving a long way away childcare. So if any proposals like that would come on the table and we don't want to duplicate efforts, how are we going to be able to extract the information from whatever sources to see if, would that be when the request they would put in to see if they're getting money from any other sources, that process? Or is Steve and Amanda or whoever going to pull information of, where some of these funds are going? I would just like a little bit of insight into that.
Well, before I acknowledge Councilman Duncan, does somebody want to respond to the hypothetical question?
That's what I was
Okay.
gonna.
Councilman Duncan.
I think it goes back to my comment earlier, was that these 2 buckets, the city bucket and the community bucket, and I think we have to decide how we want that community bucket process to be. To your response, I would envision that being as whoever we're going to designate to sift through that, whether it's the current existing committee that exists. I'm just saying whatever, or we create a new committee, or we want it to be a combination of staff and council and whatever that looks like. I think we task them with exactly what you said. Those things will come before you. You work with staff or whoever to discern that information and determine whether that project meets the criteria and the parameters that we established as a group before we handed that off to that group. So
you're saying we, council people, don't have to do the research on that, because Karen and I are already doing a humongous amount of research.
No, I'm not saying the specific research, but I think that group can say, right, I'm just saying whatever that group is can look at staff and say, okay, great, help us determine whether this is, but I think that's why I go back to, we got to figure out how we want that bucket to look, because obviously those 2 buckets are going to look very different in terms of their processes and their parameters.
Got it.
I hear.
Response also.
Pardon?
My thought is an answer to her question.
Okay. What I'm hearing is a lot of agreement as to being careful in how we proceed, being detailed in how we proceed, and looking at the ripple effect of what we eventually decide on with regards to how much money we're going to put in one side or in one bucket as opposed to another. I think it's important for us, for me anyway. I really like hearing the conversations about the opportunity for infrastructure in LMI neighborhoods who before, because of other expenses from the city, didn't have the opportunity for the positive impact that we want for everybody in this community. So when we start talking about those things, I am truly enthusiastic about having the opportunity, having the funds to support long-term changes in those neighborhoods that they have been waiting for a long time. And so I think that's important. I really like Councilman Duncan's comment, debt and home. Topeka's our home. One side of the house isn't getting taken care of, the other side of the house needs to be taken care of. So I really hear that common goal, and at the same time looking at it in a practical way that we also look at reducing our debt, paying as we go, not bonding. I think that's important for us because we all know down the road tighter times are going to be coming. We want to be prepared for that. So I think the thing that I look at the most is how is our investment in the community going to most positively impact our population? And I mean that across the board, not just continuing what we've already started, but let's expand that and let others in the city have that opportunity to enjoy what we all want. And so I am really glad to hear the governing body talking about that in different ways, but it all comes back to me anyway, is that the big intent is that we can do the most good for the greater amount of people and this one-time opportunity, so we can sit back and look that we really did take this opportunity seriously. We didn't squander the money just on personal desires and initiatives, but based on the things that we know this community needs. So I'm really encouraged by this. And that's why I wanted this meeting to kind of talk this way and start this way before we start going down a list of who wants what, because we can get caught up in that real quickly. And so this is encouraging to me. I'm looking forward to future meetings. And the other thing I hear for me is that the governing body's desire to be that conduit of information and requests to the city, even more so engaging council members with their constituency so that they're bringing to this body the concerns, desires, wants, and needs. I agree with Councilwoman Valdivia-Alcala. Childcare is something in this city that really is lacking. There's just not enough of it. It's just not affordable for a lot of people, not accessible. And when we want people to get back to work, we have to make it possible for them to get back to work. So I see a lot of hope in what we are starting to do with ARPA. And I'm encouraged by the tone of this governing body's view of their opportunity to serve the community in a bigger way. Anyone else? Councilwoman Valdivia-Alcala.
Just one more thing, Mayor. As you say that, and obviously what feels and appears to be a lot of intention behind this, I think that what will happen if we keep moving in this particular, however this flow is going, which feels pretty good right now. I mean, it's going to require a lot of work, but I think what will happen is that once these decisions are made, I think all Topekans, for the most part, are going to be able, like with debt reduction, that helps folks in the city in some ways as well. They're going to be able to see with this money, everyone was able to benefit from it as much as possible. And for LMI communities, especially as we try to give them more visibility and deal with things that have not been addressed, if we move in the right way with this, which is also always why I say, our media is so important, to see how we are trying to lift up. And I think, lift up these sections of community along with everything else we're doing. So I see it as something really affirming that is happening as well. So thank you.
Any further comments, questions? Councilwoman Hiller.
Thank you. I was going to respond also to Christina's. I think we're doing a great job of talking about those big picture intentions and goals and buckets, but I hope so that we don't have to rely on staff for the backup on everything, that we're taking notes too, in that the question that she asked about other sources of funding, and that relates to long-term funding as well. We can ask that on the applications. and ask them to identify other sources that are available and whether they're applying, and ask them what their long-term outlook is for their program and how it would be supported. So
Got it.
hopefully we can do that.
Mayor?
Councilwoman Nager.
Thank you. I think that's a great addition to our application, what Karen just mentioned, making sure that people are doing their own homework, not only making sure that they know what they're asking for from us, but that, yeah, they have a clear plan. That way we also know that we're investing in people who have done their homework and we aren't just dumping everything on staff. I think that's a great point. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
I'm going to ask the general question. Steve, do we already have an application created that we would be using for people who want to seek the ARPA funds, or is it a state application? What?
We don't have a specific one, but we can certainly modify one fairly quickly.
Okay. City Manager?
Yeah, Mayor, we have the one that we use for the social service grant, in essence, and we can utilize that if we want. I guess the question we have is, how's that process going to work? We have an idea, but as I was told, that we're not the ones to give you the process. This is your process. So just kind of waiting on when you want our input as to what the process may look like. But we need to kind of determine, step one is what's going to be the allocation breakout, because we have to start moving forward with the CIP budget and all that. And if we know we're going to use dollars for specific projects, that alleviates pressure on the CIP, and things can either be moved around or we can reduce the amount of debt. So,
Okay. Councilman Dobler?
Thank you, Mayor. I think, it seems like we've reached tentative agreement at least on kind of the general parameters, and I think one of the next steps is going to be maybe the next step is figuring out what the dollars actually are, but at some point, we're going to have to determine what our goals are for the community dollars. Is that economic development, for instance, quality of life, social service agencies, those type of things, and it seems like, I don't know, as a council, that we need to get down in the details of that. If we can just determine what our general goals are, that would seem to give direction to the community. Because frankly, I don't want somebody going through the process of filling out some general application when we have no intention of giving money to, that area. So maybe that's a good discussion to transition into. Thank you.
City Manager?
Yeah. With that, Councilman, I think what we need to do is, once we figure out how and when we want to start receiving solicitation as to who qualifies or who wants money, how much they want, and then also explaining to us how they were impacted by COVID, city staff will vet those and then bring those to me. I would think we bring them to the Social Service Committee, and then they can review those and move those to the whole body. That'd be what I would anticipate.
Councilman Emerson?
Could I just
You have a follow-up?
respond to that? Yeah, as an overall process, I think that makes sense. What I'm saying is, if we're not going to fund economic development issues, or we're not going to fund quality of life, then you need that direction up front. So somebody in the community does as well. So they're not going through the process, wasting their time on it before it gets to you. Thanks.
Councilman Emerson?
Thank you, Mayor. And first of all, I agree. I don't think I've heard anything here this morning that I disagree with. I like everything that Councilman Dobler laid out. With Councilwoman Valdivia-Acla talked about what even Lesser talked about. I agree with.
Wow.
I wish I could see his face on there right now, but I think we're all going down. I think there's consensus on the. There it is. I think there's consensus on where we're going, and I really like it. Appreciate that. But I guess just backing up a little bit, when we first had this presentation this morning from Ms. Stanley, it seems like there's a direction we need to first give which direction, whether we're going to go with pathway A, which is in my opinion, you can spend the money as you want, as you wish, or pathway B with a lot of reporting requirements. And is that correct? You guys need that first from us, or?
It would be helpful at some point to know which direction to go. But.
And I guess as a follow-up, is there any downside to the first pathway? I mean, it almost seems too good to be true, right? It's like, okay, we'll give you this money, and you don't have to fill any forms. Or option B, we'll give you the same amount of money, and you'll have a lot of reporting requirements. You'll have a lot of strings attached.
So from a finance side, and I'll certainly defer to the city manager here, but from a finance side, it's much easier to use the lost revenue. That's a similar path to what we used with CARES Act, so the body would be consistent in its approach with that.
Okay.
It doesn't mean that we wouldn't be any less transparent. So, but certainly from a reporting aspect, finance side would prefer for that.
And if I may just, as a follow-up then, thank you, Mayor. What do we need to do? Do we need to formally vote on that? Do we need to just get a consensus? Does that need to be a resolution, or how would that work?
Okay.
Do you want to go first,
Councilman Duncan?
Well, I guess my first question, which is to this, maybe this will help clear. I guess first I'll ask my question, then I have a comment about this process. The process we've sort of talked about headed towards in the terms of two pots of money, two buckets, one committee or group or whatever that's going to be looking at the community, the city. Does that process, as we've sort of headed that way, fit that option of, okay, I mean, that's the first, I'll make sure we're talking about a path that gets us to that simple process. I thought we were, but it's good to hear it from.
I think there's two different aspects of it. There's the legal, check all our boxes, make sure the federal government doesn't recoup the money. That is what the finance director means by it's easier to claim it as lost revenue. We fill out all the proper forms, we show our documentation, you put it in a separate fund that says ARPA money, and then you follow your process and you do all of your other things. But we've checked all the legal boxes with the federal government versus waiting and checking the boxes as each individual program is spent.
Okay. So I guess that leads me to my comment, and I don't know what decisions we are prepared to make today or not, so I'm not saying we have to do this now, or I'm not even going to make it a motion, right? But it seems to me we've gotten to the point to some degree where, I guess for me, the three things we need to do is one, to Councilman Emerson's question, do we need to pass, either whether it's today or soon, some formal declaration of what we just said, which process we're going to use? Second, seems to me we need to make a monetary designation of what that community bucket, we want that to look like, how many millions of this that's going to be. And then third, at least outline, not all the particulars, but what group of people on the community side we want to task with looking at what the application looks like, what those parameters are be based on discussion to bring back to the body to say, this, we're ready to move forward, here's the process we've come up with, so say you. So I mean, to me, I think those three decisions get us on a path towards moving forward to some level.
I have a question, but first, Councilwoman Hiller.
I agree, and I also think that if we do that, again, that staff could look at it. It seems like, especially since we've spent so much time on the old version, whatever that is, priority 2, bucket 2, it seems like we're on track that whatever we come up with would fit either option 1 or option 2, and that staff could decide what was the best path, bookkeeping and reporting wise for us. If we come up with our priorities and then let them give us feedback as whether there's any tweaks in that would make a difference, we might just not have to worry about that.
Amanda Stanley.
I guess just to follow up and answer your question as well as your question and your question, I guess. Federal money in ARPA specifically exempts itself from our Kansas budget laws, so we don't have to pass an ordinance or follow the revenue neutral rate or all of those fun things we normally do. So while technically you could just pass a motion and say we're designating this as lost revenue, I think I'd prefer if we did it in a resolution just for transparency in the public and they can see that we're spending, and that resolution would say we're designating this as lost revenue and direct staff to do all the reporting requirements, and then proceed with your other process for how to actually spend it.
Thank you.
I have a question for Councilman Duncan. When you said something about what body or what group would help us in determining, I guess, where some of these monies would be spent. Are you talking about something outside of the governing body? Or?
No, my preference would be governing body members.
Okay.
The question is, my view is I don't know if the social service people who are doing a lot already want to do it. They may, so I will not speak for them, but they've got a lot of other dollars, community dollar. The other committee that sort of deals with this to some degree, if we don't want them, is the TGT committee, deals with some of those factors. And I'm not sure it matters which group we designate it to, as long as we're, and whatever group it is should then include any other council members who want to participate in that process. Doesn't have to be limited to those 3 members of that body, but at least we know this is the group, this is the committee, we've put it in. That committee can expand to whoever wants to show up on this governing body and come up with that process again, which will definitely come back to the full body for approval. But that way, those nuts and bolts of what we talked about today, clarifying those parameters, that application process,
Okay.
whatever that is. But yes, no, my thought comes from us.
Okay. City manager, do you have a suggestion?
I was just going to say the other committee mayor could be the policy and finance.
Right. They all, truthfully, they can fall into any of those buckets at this point. It's just a matter of, wherever we want to put it. So.
Councilwoman Hiller.
I do think that, as people touched on earlier, we can use not only they would need some tweaking, but the application form, the scoring process, but also the priority sheet that we use for social service block grant, similarly to identify what sectors, if they're going to be community grants, what sectors the group wants to address, maybe for a follow-up meeting, unless we really on a roll and get it all done today. But, that format can be used to plug into for whoever, special committee or a standing committee that does it, I think.
City manager.
Councilwoman Hill, I agree with that, but I think one of the things, we look at that application, we would really need to tweak it. It needs to be a much simpler application, and what we're asking is actually pretty simple once we identify what's going to be eligible and not be eligible.
I think that's fine.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting, just it's something to start with.
One thing that I liked what Councilman Dobler said, and that is in setting aside these monies for these different buckets, especially the community buckets, what goals are we wanting to achieve with those community dollars? Mm-hmm. So I think that might help us pick and choose which of those projects or organizations best fit into the overall goal of this governing body. I think that's important. I'm glad he brought that up, because I think that will help.
Yep.
Whichever committee would bring recommendations, that they would see that where they fit into that overall goal for the community. So I think that's very important, rather than just, okay, everybody in this side gets something. Where's the most impact, and will it help it reach our overall goal?
Well, and one of our goals with this process was to do that also so that the public knew what we decided, and that people weren't wasting their time doing an actual proposal, that we had given it enough thought to create the framework so that people knew they were on track with something we really were going to consider, if I understood the intent of doing this process.
Yeah. At the outset of the meeting, that was one of the things I mentioned, was that make sure that we don't give out false expectations to the public, get their hopes up where they might be misguided. Not that we may not want to help, but there is, even though they're big buckets, they have a limit to them. So we still need to be able to keep that in mind when we're making these decisions. So I'm encouraged, again, like I said, about this conversation. I didn't want to jump right into, okay, we need to fund this, this, and this. I think it's important, especially for the public, who we will be asking to bring applications to us, that they understand what they're applying for, how it fits into the overall goals of the city, so that the process is as clean and as specific as possible, without giving, again, false direction to those who see an opportunity. Keeping in mind, again, the comments of debt and home. I really think that really hits to the core of it. I like that, Councilman Duncan. I think that really hits to where we can hit on all of either infrastructure or community buckets. Any further conversation? Councilman Emerson.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess going forward, it sounds like we're maybe reaching a consensus that we want to have a city bucket and a community bucket. At least from my perspective, or at least for me, it would be very helpful for me to know what the city needs are. And just looking at the things that Finance presented this morning, I guess I wanted to point out that these different revenue options, all of those have basically built in, they're assuming we're gonna increase water rates every year for the next 10 years. And I'll tell you, I would love to see this ran without, I know we've already approved them for for this year and next, I think. But I'd love to see how this changes if we don't have those increases. And I'll tell you why. You know, if you're making $100,000 a year, it doesn't matter if your water bill goes from $100 to $110, right? But if you're a young person or lower moderate income, it matters. And we're talking about the water and sewer rates increasing 60% over the next 10 years to make these numbers work. And you're talking about $50 a month more for people. So I would, before I know, I guess, how much that I'd be willing to allocate to the community bucket, I need to know what we need to do to bend some of these numbers down. So,
Councilman Duncan.
Well, so what is this? What is the exact amount that we're talking about again? Just before I ask a clarification question here.
Total dollars.
The total dollars of this ARPA pot is
40.
I mean, if you're off by a few cents, it's okay.
I would say I thought it was somewhere in there.
Okay.
We'll double check.
It's just a shy under 46.
Right, okay. So my point is, I hear what you're saying. The problem is the city can use all 46, right? I mean, I feel like if we don't, at some point, pick that community money so that the city knows, we're giving, I'm making up number, 6 is going to the community, 40 million is what you have now, use it where you best match. Because obviously, if I was staff, I would come back and say, well, we can use all 46. Now you figure out. And they could prioritize those projects. But I mean, I would think they'd like a little more direction as a more specific number of this is what we have, now let's go work with it, as opposed to the other way. That's just my thought.
Sure, and I guess, Mayor, if I can respond, I totally get that, but looking at this model, if we can, and I think they could do it in a matter of a few minutes. They change 4% to a 0 across the board, and then we know. I don't want to allocate $1 that I find out that people's water bills are going to go up 50% over the next 10 years. That's my only thing. It could be done, I think, pretty quickly, and I want to know that number so that I feel good about what the size of that community bucket is.
Me too.
Thank you. Councilman Kell?
I think if we got a wish list from all the department heads and kind of know what projects are needed and get kind of a rough amount on that, and we look at those, then we can actually maybe look at what community projects would fit into those, or what percentage for community we could go from, because as was mentioned earlier, a lot of these projects we could do from the city side of things will actually benefit the citizens overall. And so I think if we had that almost wish list with a budget, we could get to a good number, a good percentage for the community pot.
City Manager.
Councilman Kell, have you gotten the list that the previous city manager had put together? That was a list that was compiled from input from department heads. I think one of the things, to Councilman Emerson's point, reducing or trying to reduce those future costs for the citizens of Topeka. But within those projects, one of those is the lead pipe removal. Now, what's really good about that, like Councilwoman Valdivia-Acla said, infrastructure dollars are allocated for that. But we need to have a fallback plan that if we don't get those dollars, we have dollars designated to remove those lead pipes, because that is a public health and safety issue for a lot of our individuals that live in LMI neighborhoods that still have those lead pipes. So it's kind of a contingency planning thing as we move forward. It's having those fallback options and stuff that we can do.
Councilman Kell, did that answer your question or speak to your suggestion?
Well, yes, and I understand being the new member that I'm not privy to all the information that's been put out there, but I do not believe I've received that list. I don't think I've ever seen that wish list or list compiled by the former city manager. So if that could be sent to me, that'd be great. Thank you.
Councilman Kelly, you're privy to all the information that you want. You just ask for it, and we'll make sure you get it. Okay?
I was unaware a list was like that has been already been compiled.
Okay. Thank you. Further comments? Councilwoman Hedler.
Well, I guess maybe we're not there yet, but just to kind of float some numbers to get us started. I do have those lists, Brett, and so I think our magic number is 45.67 million and some change. And if that's correct, then the kind of thought that an option, for instance, would be 43 million to utilities and infrastructure, the 1.5 million that we've already allocated for hazard pay, and 1.1 million for community or other, whatever. We have some community and other on that list. Now,
Just repeat that if you would.
I just played with it. 43 for utilities and infrastructure, 1.5 for the hazard pay that we've already voted to commit, and that would leave 1.1 for community or other. Now, maybe people want to do more than that. That's just if people want to do 10 million for that, that gives us an idea of how to swing that and come up with maybe at least some parameters on the buckets.
I like that place to start, Mayor, if I could.
Yes, Councilman Dobler.
Did the hazard pay, didn't that come out of previous COVID dollars?
No, it was allocated out of the ARPA dollars, sir.
Okay. All right. Very good. Thank you. And follow-up question, if I could.
Yes, please.
Do we have an accounting? So this is the second round of COVID money that we've received, right?
Yes, so the first funds would have been CARES dollars.
Right.
And then now we get the
They've
ARPA
been
dollars.
totally expended.
Steve, we still have some, right?
No.
There's about $2 million left that hasn't been directly committed. So there were
Targeted towards something, or is it just sitting there?
Yes.
there was some conversation, Councilman Duncan, as far as potential on HVAC for the city hall, but I don't think it's been directly committed.
But that would, under this scenario, that would fall under our infrastructure discussion, right? If we were to throw that into the pot.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Following up, would the hazard pay be eligible for that other money,
Which other? The CARES dollar?
CARES money?
CARES money?
Yes.
Yes? Okay.
Okay. Councilwoman Valdivia-Acla.
Okay, just a general question with that outline that Karen just gave right now. How is there something that I haven't calculated? Maybe we're 43 million, and I know it's just a starting point. I know it's just putting out a figure, but that just seems like a huge amount. And I just wondered how you got to that figure.
Because it was a priority, and we're spending 100 million a year or whatever, so it would go in
100
a
million a
heartbeat.
year on?
Utility.
Okay, utilities.
It would go in a heartbeat.
Councilman Emerson.
And I guess also, Councilwoman, I believe also 20 million is roughly what the Polk Quincy Viaduct utility relocations were. And so I think that was part of that as well. which is money we'd otherwise have to take out of the bond or general fund.
Yeah, so it must be just naive me that didn't know that that huge amount of money was possibly the number that we were going to be looking at. That's humongous. Thank you.
Councilman Lesser.
This is to the new councilman, Mr. Kill. Piece of advice, and it's not as funny. I've had my hand up for like 45 minutes, but if you look at the frickin' monitor, everyone. So this would have been much funnier at the frickin' time, but since you can't do two things at once, apparently I might have to just wait. But
I can do one thing real quickly. So
Push that button.
go ahead and proceed.
I know you can, brother. Let's not use the word wish list. Let's use the word priority list for a bureaucratic organization. Otherwise, I'm going to take you to the woodshed, Brett.
Understood.
Councilman Duncan.
I generally like Councilwoman Hiller's suggestion, except I'd prefer if that number was 42 million and 2.1 million to the community. I think that's a little different commitment, and that's all. That would be the only tweak I'd have if you're asking for changes. Nothing too drastic, just $1 million here or there. But yeah, that'd be my preference if we're headed in that direction. Thank you.
Well, and if we can use the money that we already have sitting at COVID money for that hazard pay, then we've got that 1.5 million available. That's the kind of conversation we need to have as it gets down the line.
Here's my ask. In looking at these, I'm sorry. Who? Sylvia? Okay, sorry. Councilwoman Ortiz.
Thank you. At this point, I would like to have staff provide all of us what money is set aside for this, what money is set aside for that, so we get a clear understanding. Like you just said, we have this COVID money over here that we haven't used. We have this money that's not dedicated to yet, but is talked about so that the council gets a clear understanding before we start making these marks. I personally want to see as much money as we can poured back into the community, because I think that's going to be, they're going to look at 46 or 47 million, and a million was just a drop in the bucket, and I want to see as much poured back as possible. But I also want to understand what we have and what we don't have, whether it's past, present, or now. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Councilman Lesser, do you have your hand up again? Just want to make sure. Are you sitting on your hand? Sit on your hand. Councilwoman Valdivia Acala.
Thank you, Mayor. Okay, so this might be where we're getting into the nitty gritty.
Yeah.
So maybe I forgot that 20 million of this had been bandied about to lessen the amount of bonds that we take out, right? For the 20 million for Polk. I agree with Sylvia in that I would also like to see as much money as we can, understanding that we know debt reduction is important. It is important. I also agree with Sylvia in the way that if we're only looking at about, out of almost $47 million, 1.5, maybe even 2 million of that going back to community, I think there's going to be a rub somewhere. And I don't know if that rub has to happen here first as we eke this out, but I do not think, especially with infrastructure money that's going to be coming down the pike, I do not think that, at least in LMI communities, and Sylvia and Karen and whoever has LMI communities would need to speak to this, but I think that would be a hard pill to swallow with that huge a bite going all to infrastructure. That's why I think, yes, seeing numbers like Tony is requesting right now, so that LMI folks can see how their utility bills will be helped along, so we can look at that bigger picture. I guess my kind of rub, though, is with Pope Quincy. Thank you, Mayor.
Okay. Councilman Dover.
City Manager, is the 20 million for Pope Quincy accurate?
The answer to that would be no. We have been working with KDOT very diligently, and we do have new numbers that we've been presented. And so our, and you're talking about the additional 20 million on top of the 20 that we had initially talked about for utilities, correct?
Correct. The utility relocation, that's the city's responsibility, is what I'm talking about.
Yes, that number's been drastically reduced.
Okay. Thank you.
Been reduced, you say?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Before we move on in the conversation, I'd like to be able to take a quick break. If we could break for until, let's say, 11 o'clock, so about a 9-10 minute break. We come back to our discussions. I appreciate your attention. Thank you very much. We'll be on a break right now for about till 11 o'clock. I'd like to continue this discussion, but to follow up on a couple of things. I will initially say that the recommendation that Councilman Hiller falls short of something I was hoping for, but I'm sure that we're all going to have that perspective that it either meets our expectations or not. But I would like to entertain a suggestion with regards to our buckets of money and discuss this with City Manager if you would like to present to the group.
Mayor and the governing body, we're going to receive a total of just ARPA dollars, $45,676,831. Of that, we have received $22,838,415.50.
2 million.
But
You said 1,000. You meant
Million.
yeah, 22 million. So, yeah, going the other way. But keeping in mind that approximately $45 million, my recommendation would be that we go ahead and say that we are going to allocate $35 million towards infrastructure purposes, with the remainder to be determined upon the City Council's approval as to how they would like to spend those funds.
Okay. Having heard his recommendation, I'd like to hear some comments before we proceed. Understanding that what City Manager is trying to do is give us a starting point, and at the same time still leave opportunity for us to discuss what we want to accomplish more with infrastructure and debt, and what we want to specifically accomplish with our community dollars, so that we really give it more consideration and really to address Councilman Kell's observation. This is a lot coming at you, Councilman, and this is just the first of many meetings we'll have. I want to give you the opportunity to review, visit with the City Manager and other council members with regards to your concerns, your questions, and I think doing it this way gives us our first step. It doesn't undercommit or overcommit, I think it gives us a good starting point. So, Councilman Dobler.
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick question. So we're setting the bar at 35 million for infrastructure. It means we could go above that for additional infrastructure, but we're not going to go below it, if I'm understanding. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that'd be the recommendation.
All right. And then the 10 million or whatever it is could all go to the community bucket or just some portion of it yet to be determined.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilwoman Valdivia Alcala.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess until we could know what those figures are, I would hesitate to follow that lead. I mean, do we know when we're going to have those figures?
Was that the?
And I'm sorry, just as a point of clarification, Mayor, we were briefly talking there during the recess, and I think what I'd like to see, and I think hopefully I'm on the right track here, what number would we need to program for utilities going forward so we did not have the increases for the next 10 years?
And we're looking at that. Councilman, the one thing that we're going to have to take best guess on is rate of inflation.
Right.
So
if 4% in there now, right? It's 7 point
that's
something
correct.
right
so
now.
If your rates are not tracking with rate of inflation, then you're either going to have to reduce. You have to reduce something.
Yeah, I'm afraid if we, with everything we know going forward with both interest rates and inflation rates, if you put those in there, we're getting about 60 million of this 46 million. So, yeah, to keep rates neutral.
So is what that is saying then, Tony, is as they attempt to do these projections, that what we were talking about is that we see for the next 10 years, rates are going to continue to go up for residents that get water, and with that, is that sewer also?
Yes.
All of that is going to go up so that at the end of 10 years, they could be looking at how much of a percentage of increase. Just throw something out.
About 50 to 60%.
So that our Topeka residents could be looking at, in the next 10 years, up to a 50% increase. Now, as you stated, someone that owns a $100,000 home, that's not going to be a big burden. But when we have, is that what you said?
Someone that's making a lot of money.
Oh, I'm sorry,
a
100,000 a year,
Yeah.
it's not going to be a big deal. But if we have folks in our LMI communities, there's a number of couples, elder couples, that live on less than $1,000 a month.
Yeah.
And so what that would be doing is using that, and I'm trying to make it as clear as possible for people that are listening, is that what that would do is using that ARPA money, which may even exceed how much ARPA money that we have, which is really depressing, to help where that increase does not go directly to our residents of Topeka.
That's absolutely correct.
Councilman Duncan.
So then I have a question based on that for staff, and I'd like the real answer, not the maybe that's what Spencer wants to hear answer. Okay. If we put as an action item on our February 1st agenda the proposal that the city manager just put forward of the 35 million, does that still fit your folks' timeline of being able to start crunching numbers for CIP, whether we pass it or not, we'll get into, and also provide the information that these council members are looking for? I mean, as opposed to making that decision today. I just want to know if that gives everyone the time they need to process stuff, and Councilmember Cal, everybody to sort of.
My team says yes.
Okay, so that would be my first recommendation if that's doable, and that gives everyone time to kind of do what they need to do in the next couple of weeks. And then my second would be also as an action item on that agenda, we designate, and it sounds like social services doesn't want it for all the right reasons, not because they don't want the work. They got
said that.
No, well, and so, or at least try to choose whether perhaps policy and finance designate that committee that would then, because they're too independent. To me, regardless of what the dollar amount is, the process and the parameters can start to be worked on for that community dollars. over the next few months, so that we also would put that on as an action item to designate that committee to start working on that process. That way we have these next couple weeks now that we all think we're moving in the right direction, but we can all process the information next couple weeks. Those would be my suggestions.
Councilwoman Hiller.
I think he's definitely on the right track, but I also think, based on the conversation that we've had in the last half hour, that for a committee to set the priorities on the quote community money, since city manager's proposal is 35 million, which means there would be 11 million or almost 10.5 million. There's a big difference between prioritizing $2 million or $3 million and $11 million. So we might need to spend a little more time on how we wanted to spend that last 11 million before we tasked a committee to prioritize. It's just a thought, because we've got some proposals that are big, that if there was a lot of money, maybe that committee would leave them that category in, but if there's 2 million, might not.
Councilman Duncan.
Yeah, and that's totally understandable. My thought was the committee would even start more basic than that. Like, this is what the application might look like. These are the first parameters, and then, so it would not be an immediate. I mean, I thought that process could take a little while, months, not weeks. That was kind of my, since it's going to take us some time to designate that. So just my suggestion, because I know we all want to move this forward, but we also don't want to hurry it up. Right, we're in that weird sort of, we want to keep moving forward, but I also know there's some information for people to digest. So I would just suggest if everyone works for everybody, staff-wise particularly, I would suggest we just make those decisions then.
Mr. Wade.
May I ask a question, please, for intent? Councilman Emerson.
Yes, sir.
So I want to make sure I understand intent. We know that we will have cost of goods increases, cost of labor increases over the next 5 to 10 years.
Right.
And so we had modeled that out originally at 3%. To stay flat, your rates would then have to increase 3% as a blended rate, 3% just to stay flat.
Right.
Is it your intent, sir, to stay flat, or was it your intent to not have any rate increases, and therefore we're subsidizing the cost of good increases?
So I guess right now we're having hundreds of water line breaks a year. Those water line breaks, I think, cost $4,000 or $5,000 minimum, and ones that are in major intersections like 21st Street and Adams Street, they're much more than that. I guess my thought is, to the extent we can use this money to get ahead of that maintenance and bend some of those costs down, so we're not just chasing leaks all over the place. As Councilwoman Nager said, her neighbor's yard's been dug up now in 2 places. We fixed this 3-foot section, and then the next 3-foot section that's 60, 70, 80, 100 years old breaks. If we don't get ahead of those things, we're not going to be able to afford to have water in the city at some point. So I would love to get ahead, and what would programming a certain amount of money towards that, how much money do we need to do, I guess, so that we can keep rates flat over the next 10 years instead of a 4, 5, or 6% increase? So if that's any clearer.
That helps.
Okay.
Thank you.
I appreciate your comments, Councilman Emerson, because I agree with you. We have to do something to get a hold on those utility rate increases. It's not sexy, it's not pretty, but it affects us all. So
it hurts. I got my water bill just yesterday, $99. And last year it was, and I'm not picking on utilities. A lot of this stuff is, we have all these unfunded mandates. A lot of our utility money right now is going to plant upgrades, which are an unfunded federal mandate. They don't do a damn thing for the average user here in Topeka, but they help some help some bureaucrat at the federal level feel better about things. So it frustrates me, but anyway.
Councilwoman Hiller.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm thinking with this request, one of the things I think some of us, maybe all of us, are trying to do is quantify what kind of savings, how this could impact particularly LMI folks, but everybody in terms of their water bills. And those 6% raises, I mean, if you were talking about bills going up 50% over the course of time, which maybe we need to ask you to quantify too. If that takes a minimum $80 bill and makes it $40 a month, $120, so that being able to flatline that means $40 a month for an LMI person, which is $500 a year. That's a lot of money, but it may be that staff can't get it that far. And so if there were some gradations in that even $10 a month shaved off those projected increases is $120 a year that would not be assessed to LMI users. And so if it turns out there's more than one way to look at it, if we have some dollars out of it, I think that'll be helpful.
I'm sorry. Can you just say that last part again? The last part you just said about 10, did you say 10%?
Well, $10 a month increase, which is far less than what Councilman Emerson was talking about in terms of, I mean, as far as I know, I've got pretty close to a minimum water, sewer, trash bill right now, and it's gone up to $80 a month instead of $60. It's $20 a month in the last few years. He was saying they were going to go up 50%,
right,
which is $40 a month.
Right.
And so the deal is if we can't shave the whole thing, even $10 a month is $120 a year for everyone, impacting LMI people more than the people with the $100,000 a year income. So I was thinking if, depending on what the staff, when they dive into it, come up with, even if we can't withhold the increases altogether, what could we do with it? What's reasonable to think we could do with it, and have a number rather than just a percent? That's what.
Councilwoman Valdivia.
Thank you, Mayor. I agree with that. The other thing, this is just a really it's not off the mark, but I'm sure it's not going to be possible. But let's just say that however much is figured to go towards utilities to help, offset these utilities, water costs that we're talking about. And let's say we have that stretched out. And then how about if we get some infrastructure money in that would help with that? Could we take that money that was promised and then use it towards other incentive or other programs and just put the infrastructure money there?
Yes, especially if you pass the resolution designating as lost revenue, then as far as the feds are concerned, we've spent it. And so then if infrastructure money comes down the pike, you could reallocate it in different ways.
So that's a possibility that I would think, we would really want to consider. The other thing is tracking. If we're going to keep this as a separate fund, and if we're not going to have that responsibility to the feds to do it for every project, are we still going to be just committed to that tracking process, especially when we look at the community dollars and what we're looking in the way of outcomes as well? Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
Councilman Dobler.
Thanks, Mayor. I guess I don't think there's an answer for this today, but when we voted for the increase in water rates a couple of years ago, I think the expectation given by staff at that point was 6 miles of water line improvements, replacements every year, which addresses the broken water mains. And I don't know that we're there yet. I mean, there is some contention by some members of the community that we're not there. And I guess I would like, first of all, we're not talking about doing 7 or 8 miles a year. We're talking about continuing to do the 6 million, but paying cash for it as opposed to bonding. That debt service. I don't know what portion of your budget in utilities is debt service, but I'm guessing it's sizable at this point. So that allows a better look, I guess, at future water rates. I want to make sure that we're addressing the 6 miles a year right now. And I realize there's ramp up time, there's lots of things that happen, but it would be good to get maybe an update on that from utilities sometime soon here, particularly as we start to talk about the CIP. Second thing is somebody mentioned reporting. I want to make sure that when projects come before the council, or when we talk about them, or when they're in the CIP, whatever it is, that it's designated that ARPA funds are, what portion of those projects are being paid for with ARPA funds. So we don't just, drop a chunk of change into the utilities and then, 3 or 4 years later, people are asking where that went, because we know those questions are going to come at some point. Thank you.
I wholeheartedly agree about that, because you're right. Those questions always come as well. We don't see anything. How is it? Can we be confident that it was used in the way it was intended? So I think it's important for us to be able to do that, and updates on a regular basis as to where we are and what portions of the money were used for the projects is important to the community. Councilwoman Hiller.
Follow up on that with a question to Steve, if I may. You're about to embark on you said an outcomes-based budgeting model, right? So is part of that intent to address exactly what Councilman Dobler just said, that if we've set a goal of 6 miles a year, that instead of just telling us how many projects we did and how much money we spent, that we'll get reports on whether we did 6 miles a year of water lines, as an example?
That's our intent.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, just quickly, I think the real outcome, though, is not the six miles of pipeline, it's a reduction in water main breaks.
Absolutely.
That's, ultimately, that's where we need to get.
Absolutely.
Councilwoman Valdivia.
Thank you, Mayor. And to build on top of all of that, being able to share that in any way, shape, or form, even if we put it up in an airplane and put it across the city.
That's a good idea.
That is what is happening as we build into all of this.
Exactly.
We're actually working on a model that would accommodate that.
Because I've asked before about our half-cent sales tax when we did the very first one, and then the citizens spoke up, and I always paraphrase it, but sort of like, you idiots, why would you just redo the top of the street without doing what's underneath it? And the city pivoted immediately and said, yes, you're right, and we'll do what's under the streets before we zip them back up with rebuilding the top. And I've asked periodically, maybe every year in the CIP hearings, what our score was on water main breaks on redone streets, and the staff has never had an answer yet. So that will be good. Be good.
Well, that was a clear request, I would suspect, is that hopefully we can get that answer and have it on a regular basis. Thank you, Councilwoman. Where else are we right now with regards to Councilman Duncan's suggestion or motion to place on the agenda that request?
Mayor, could he repeat that?
Yeah.
So I had two, but the first one was taking the city manager's request of going ahead and designating that at least $35 million towards those infrastructure projects, essentially so staff can start putting some lists together for us to review. I know there's others who want numbers, need some information still, new to the council. So my thought was February 1 is 2.5 weeks away, give or take 3 weeks. That would give everyone time, if we put it on the agenda item for that evening, to make that to take a vote on that recommendation. Hopefully by then everyone will have data, we'll have water rate information and all. That was my thought. That way we're still moving forward, but we're not pushing it off.
And the motion would be just to place it on the agenda, not to accept that specific amount is in his recommendation, or am I incorrect?
My recommendation would be put as an action item to designate $35 million of our ARPA funds towards those infrastructure and improvement projects.
Okay.
And then staff still has to come back to us for approval of what those projects are. So we're not approving everything they want to do, but we're at least giving them a dollar amount. But in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, we may have information where we will have a discussion about amending that number or voting it down because we've seen new data or information that we've all requested here today.
Let me ask Amanda Stanley.
I just asked a clarification on that. So what I think you want is a resolution. As part of that resolution, would you like us to also do we want it to be considered lost revenue portion?
Oh, yeah, I thought we were. Yes, I think we all are. Yes. So that's all. I was just trying to accommodate the city manager, but also make sure we all had our ducks in a row.
Councilman Nimerson.
I'll do that in a second, yeah.
And Councilman Duncan, I would fully support what you're saying with the caveat that can we leave that number? Can we not set a number right now? And my only problem is once we say 35, then everybody's going to expect that. You know, it just, I guess it anchors
Oh, I'm sure.
something.
We can leave that, right? Blank. We will determine blank number on.
Because I would like to see the numbers that
yeah, no, it's
come
fine.
back.
Yeah, no, I'm fine with that.
That's my only thing. I just hate to anchor it starting at that because then
Right.
if we find out we need 46
Right. Well, we may
million.
decide February 1 we get to that meeting and we're not ready, and we can always punt it to a few weeks. But at least it gets us in front of us.
Yeah.
I appreciate that clarification because that was the thing I wanted to avoid.
Yeah.
If you set a number too soon, then you already have your mind set now.
Understood. Yeah, I wasn't stuck on the number as much as the request. So.
Yeah, I'd support it. Thank you.
Councilwoman Hiller.
It may be critical, just so there's not misunderstanding, that we put parameters on the entire 45.6, in that if we say the 35 only, then people are going to think the 10 is for other things, and what we is for grants and applications. And with the discussion that I heard today was that we would continue working on what we would do with that other. And it might be the best to have the clarification for the whole 45.6 in that, to make it clear that the other is still being considered rather than available, if you will.
Councilman Duncan.
I assume that language can be part of that, just that whatever number we plug into that space and that the rest will be considered for further consideration, no designation at this time, whatever that legalese is. And
Amanda, you don't have any issue with that? Okay. Further comments? I want to make sure that I...
My second, and then, the second part of that was, my second recommendation was, there's steps it seems we clearly want to start taking on the community bucket, whatever those dollars are, to at least designate a committee to send that to by next week. And that way they can start setting up meetings and timelines.
And that this will be Karen and Christina.
Can I just say something? I asked to be on the policy and finance.
Right, well, no, that's fine, right. So,
before you knew.
Before you knew.
we can leave that blank if you'd like. My recommendation at the time would be policy and finance, but if we want to leave a blank there like we are with the dollar, and again, just to be able to know on that February meeting, we're going to make that designation so somebody can start moving forward.
I think that's
fairly enough, he's signing up for policy and finance.
That's right.
He's not putting that off on
I am,
someone
and
else.
it's right. I am not putting it off on someone else. I plan to be on that committee, and so I'm handcuffing myself along with everybody else who's on it.
Then I want to trade my option.
Well, whoever the deputy mayor is selected will have that
We'll
responsibility.
make those determinations.
Yep.
Yep. But so that way we can move forward on those two things without, So those would be my two suggestions.
I like your idea. I like your proposal. Yeah. So can we move forward with this in its form that he's presented to us, Amanda, and move on to the next meeting, setting a date and time for our next meeting so we can follow up on the details and information that has been requested and discussed today?
Yeah, Mayor, I believe we have clear direction as to what you want from us. And I think, is it February, the first Saturday in February, is that when you would like to reconvene?
Is that okay? My two items were for the February 1 council
Correct.
meeting. Okay, so are we then talking about an additional ARPA meeting
Yes.
for other talks and discussions? That seems early.
Yeah, I guess that was going to be my thing. We're going to decide things on that Tuesday night, and then it's going to be hard to have stuff ready for that very next Saturday.
Yeah, do a week later. Give us some time to review the information.
That'd be February 12th.
Make sure that all council members have it.
February 12th then?
What's that?
Yeah.
A Saturday again?
That's it.
Nobody's got Valentine's plans. Checking.
That's the 14th.
I know.
But that's the weekend.
As long as we're not doing it that
Don't you
night.
do Valentine weekend, Tony? You
Please
told me.
don't suggest that. Well, my wife, we don't have cable at home, so my wife will not be watching this. So, no, I don't.
I got Laugh Lines tickets, but I think we'll be done by then.
Okay.
Okay, anything else for today's meeting that any of the council members would like to bring up online? I want to make sure that I don't...
Mayor?
Okay, Councilwoman Nager.
Thank you. I just wanted to say I'm incredibly encouraged by the consensus we've seen today. I'm really excited on working on this as a group. and that we're not quibbling over it. We're going to be really productive for the community, and that's what needs to happen.
Thank you. And special thanks to Councilman Lesser. Anyone else, any comments before we adjourn? Again, thank you very much for spending your Saturday with us. Have a good weekend. Be safe on the roads. Meeting adjourned.